So we're starting over, starting fresh.
We're going to start fresh, but at least we got kind of a, I'm going to, it's 2.0, but this is the actual one that we're going to put out. And based on our last conversation, I will let the audience know that we had one that was really, really great and really made me, it was actually our first, Tristan, was that our first recording? Oh, we had Pat we had a couple of trials, but that was the actual first real podcast episode we were trying to get out. Yeah. So, but it was also very inspiring. So, here we go. Hey, I think this is going to be something. Before we had talked about quite a few kind of tough subjects, I think, that would be questions that people out there that may not be as familiar with church in general, but also other people who may be from different denominations and things like that and questioning. I know we dabbled with the, and I'd like to get back into that too at some point tonight, the Catholic and Protestant. And that's a big one for me because my wife's Catholic. So there's quite a bit of others, but I wanted to first start off. So church at Oakwood, that's where you're...
Woodlawn.
Oak Woodlawn, okay.
Woodlawn, just Woodlawn.
Woodlawn.
Yeah. The reason people say Oak is there's Oak Lawn literally right down the street.
Yeah, I'd seen it on your thing, so is it actually just Oak Lawn Church, or what's the actual, how do you say it?
Okay, so Oak Lawn is a Baptist church down the street from us. Woodlawn is the church I lead, and it comes out of a Presbyterian background, but we honor that and those kinds of things. But really, our congregation is made up of people from all different backgrounds. And so even though we have some partners and friends and a team that we work with the Presbyterians or Cumberland Presbyterians, but specifically, we are a church made up of people from a lot of different backgrounds and perspectives. I would say just from the top of my head, we have former Roman Catholics, Southern Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Pentecostals, just people from all walks of life spiritually that find their way to Woodlawn. And from a branding standpoint, our website is thechurchatwoodlawn.com, and we just kind of casually call ourselves Woodlawn Church.
Cool. So again, what was the actual name of the church if people are looking for it?
Woodlawn Church.
So again, as far as people looking for the church, the name of the church is Woodlawn.
Woodlawn, thechurchatwoodlawn.com. It's probably the easiest way to find.
Yeah, and we're going to put that in the description as well, all your stuff. So, and how long have you been there?
I have been there almost 3.5 years.
And how long has the church been there?
The church is on its 98th year, and in May of 27, we will celebrate a centennial, 100 years.
That's awesome. Yeah, so do you have some parishioners there that are from, I guess, several years back? Do you have like some elders, I guess you would say?
Sure. We have some folks in their 80s and 90s who've been with Woodlawn most or all of their lives. We don't have, obviously, anyone that was there 98 years ago, but we've got some folks that are pretty close and whose parents may have been back there that long.
So I guess one of the questions I would have starting out about that is a lot of churches and one of the, I don't know if I want to actually go there. A lot of churches that have been around for a while seem to not have a lot of youth in it, like children. I don't know why that is. People grow up, they move away. You have a pretty big youth group there?
We have a lot of teenagers. We also have a lot of 20-somethings. It's probably the fastest growing group within our church. Joe, I think the reason for that, or at least a primary reason, is that if you look at the amount of cultural change that's existed in the last, say, 50 years, really, if you go back 100 years, the amount of cultural change from the things like the internet, technology. When you and I were in high school, the computers that we had were, the coolest thing they would do is make a little sound, or maybe you could play a little video game where a dot bounces back and forth between two lines. Whereas now we have supercomputers in our pockets. And so I think a lot of churches struggled with making the adjustments that they needed to make so that they could communicate clearly in the current society in which we live. And so for that reason, when someone was like, I'm Gen Xer, as you are, I was raised before email, but I got email, and then I now wouldn't know what to do without email. Whereas my kids were born with email. I'll use this example. For the most part, up until they became adults, neither of my sons had a Bible that had a leather bound outside. It was they literally carried an iPad. And so that when someone would say turn to the book of Ephesians, that language doesn't even make sense to them because they're typing in EPH, and they're pulling it up versus turning, which turning to my age group makes perfect sense. And so, if you could, like boost that kind of little thing to a lot of the major things to try and help understand why so many young adults don't feel at home in a lot of churches that still have more of a 1950s, 1960s, 1970s culture. It's literally like asking them to speak a different language. They just don't live in the world that a lot of churches live in. And so what churches have had to do, from my perspective, is they've had to determine what are the things that by nature of our identity as Christians can't and should never change, versus what are the areas where we have the flexibility to make adjustments so that we can communicate with, a culture that's developing around us. And that's not a new thing. Every Christian missionary who's ever gone to a culture that's different than he or she was raised in have had to ask that question. How do I take what I know to be true in my raised in Alabama world, and now I'm in Zimbabwe, where nothing is the same? How do I translate the things that can never change about Christianity to the world that needs me to say it to them in a way that they will understand? That's what a lot of churches haven't done, sadly, right here in America. And those who are doing it, we find that sometimes there might be disagreement between what should be able to change and what should not be able to change. But there are some churches, a lot of churches that have done a really good job of communicating with a younger culture. And it's why some of the fastest growing, largest churches in America are made up of a bunch of 20-somethings because they found a way to speak to that culture. I'm convinced that, and I'm come from a purely Christian perspective, but I'm convinced that the gospel is just as powerful as it's always been, but it has to be communicated in language and in, visuals and in story that fits the culture that you're trying to communicate with. And if you don't, then a lot of times people aren't going to hear it.
So, yeah, I see that as a generational thing too, because I remember, I'm going to be really honest and expose myself a little here. I can remember when I was 20-something and going to a very holiness church, a very strict Bible, church, and it was a struggle. And it felt like this particular situation, this particular group of people, not just that one church, but the whole group, they reveled in the fact that, they made a long sermon, and then also, I can remember going to church on Wednesday night at 7 and get out of there at 11. We would go Saturday during the day and clean the church. And then Saturday night was prayer meeting, which would last from 7 to 11. Sunday morning, you get there and do Sunday school from 9 and get out sometimes at 1:30. And then back at church again at 6. And then sometimes that was your big one from 6 to 11:30 at night, and it was just a lot. And it was almost like they were telling you, you're doing this almost for repentance. You do this. It reminded me of the monks, who would maybe commit a sin and they would lash themselves, That's kind of how it felt they were saying is, you make this sacrifice because Jesus made the sacrifice for you. And I was like, it would be so much better if it was just something more enjoyable, or, even, and I hate to use this word because it's not really what I'm trying to get out, but entertaining. And, for me, we went to Cozumel, and that was the last time we went anywhere. My wife and I went on our honeymoon 10-ish, 11-ish years ago. And, we were there, and I'm not a big beach guy. It gets boring after a while. I'm not a sit down and do. But we went and we were listening to this guy tell stories of the Mayans and how the men were attracted to women with crossed eyes, so they would hang a bead down between their eyes so that they would eventually go cross-eyed. And just that learning and that experience, I could listen to that stuff all day long. I tell people, my teenagers, kids going to college and things. I'm like, I envy you, man. If I could sit and just learn all day, that's all I had to do, I would be great. But then you go to church and it becomes more of a job, for us to go. So I think you're right.
That's unfortunate. I think that's truly unfortunate. So a couple of things I would throw at you about that. One, and I don't want to pick on the group that you were raised with, but lots of Christian groups have both what you might call biblical morality. So that would be things like don't steal, don't kill, don't cheat, those things. But they also have like a cultural morality, like some, don't have facial hair, always wear long sleeves, women's dresses should be skirts to their ankles. And there's not any like real biblical clarity in any of those things. That is, whether you're talking about the Amish community, the Mennonite community, or more modern versions, so many Christian groups at some point, they grab this time in history and they go, that's what morality looks like. And then 50 years later or 100 years later, they're chewing out their teenage boys for the ear, their hair touching their ears or something like that, And so I saw that video on Facebook today. It was just ridiculous. This dude wasting a bunch of preaching time to chew out teenage boys in the crowd because their hair's too long, And so, I don't mean to slam anybody's particular version of the faith, but the honest reality is, we can't elevate our cultural morality to the point where we treat it as if it's biblical morality, because they're not the same thing. One of my favorite stories to tell is, I was raised in Western Kentucky. For the most part, Christians did not drink publicly, and yet almost every man I knew growing up smoked cigarettes. I spoke at a church in Seattle, Washington, and while there, the pastor and about 30 people took me out to church after the restaurant afterwards, where everybody had a glass of wine, but none of them smoked cigarettes, and talked about how horrible it is to smoke cigarettes. It's like those are cultural issues more than they are biblical issues. So the other thing I would say is, you were talking about services that were really long and drawn out. Think about this. If you were raised in 1920 and your only other option was slopping horses and, cleaning out stalls and, getting behind a mule and plowing a field and milking cows, you would have loved to get to sit there in that building with a fan on you for 4 hours. You know what I mean? Like, because that was the world in which that culture was developed. What the sad reality is that somebody forgot to ask the question, hey, listen, are we doing the 4-hour service thing because that's what God expects of us? Or are we doing the 4-hour service thing because that's what became normal in our culture? Because our culture's changing. And if our culture's adapting and changing, we better make sure that we know the difference between the things that God expects us to never change, which surprisingly is not nearly as high of a list as you might think, versus the things that we as a people have grown to love culturally. And, and so it's like, I'll give you an example. I grew up in a church that for the most part musically was a piano and an organ, was the musical thing. And by the time I got there, I just thought that was like holy instruments. But the reality is pianos came into churches because they were a hit in the club, in the saloons. So they brought pianos into churches because the men were hanging out at the saloon and loved the music. And they started writing songs that would attract men to come to the church, and they brought in the piano to do it. And in the beginning, the old codgers at the church hated the piano being brought in. You know what I mean? Like, and we're in the late 1800s probably here. So again, cultural development, not biblical development. I think what a lot of pastors have to do, and what I've spent my life trying to learn to do, is, man, I'm gonna like nail down those things that biblically will never change about the gospel. Like, if you change these things, it's no longer Christianity. But besides that, everything else needs to be as flexible as possible so that you can reach the culture around you in a way that's effective and helpful and good. That's my personal opinion.
Well, to that, I, how you were saying that the younger groups, we think should just kind of assimilate to, I don't know, you were necessarily saying that, but a lot of times assimilate to church. And that's exactly what happened with me. I mean, I was an exer and I was in with a bunch of people who believed a certain way, and the world was changing. And so that played there too. And it's kind of funny that you were talking. My first podcast with Yona, who's a martial artist and talking about mixed martial arts. We were talking about the Gracies and how it's really obvious if you were really into it back then. The Gracies changed the world of martial arts. Had it always been there? Yes. But when we talk about the world was, very strict traditional karates and things like that. But then as the development of mixed martial arts went on, you started seeing immediately everybody after the Hoist Gracie, they wanted to learn how to grapple. Then you started seeing it evolve into, okay, you had a lot of strikers who, let's just not go there. I want to learn how not to go there. And I believe that at that point, a lot of the jiu-jitsu guys held to did just exactly what the rest had done before prior. They did not evolve with that, and it took them a while to assimilate to that situation. And I think that's the thing you're kind of with the church is, this world is changing, and now faster than ever. I mean, it is something new every day. And not only, I think you have to, as a church leader, think of what am I competing against with these guys? And for years and years and years, it was evil and good and God and the devil. Well, maybe it still is, but those things all play a part out in the world, like the entertainment values that are out there. You have to get someone to believe something before they're going to be, just come out just because they need something else to draw them there. And I think that's something, maybe the churches need to look at.
Sure. To your point, I think there may be more interest in stories of redemption in the world right now than I've ever seen. I'm not that old, but the idea of a story of redemption is extremely welcome by the culture in which we live. So many people want to know, how did this guy, experience some sort of redemption? How did this person go through this? Because the idea that we're messed up, I don't think that's a secret. The fact that whether it be addiction or broken relationships or anxiety or lack of happiness and joy, like I don't think we have to yell at people that the world is screwed up for people to know the world is screwed up. The world's looking for and open to all these stories of redemption. The problem is so many congregations and churches and specifically pastors stopped talking about redemption, when that is the sole purpose of the gospel, is the way God is bringing about redemption in his people. And instead of being a congregation of redemption, helping people find this redemption story, a lot of groups slipped into kind of championing a particular version of morality or a particular version of behavior or a particular dress code or those kinds of things. And there's no redemption in a salvation that you have to earn through your actions. That's not redemptive. That's not a biblical redemption at all. And so when we realize the world is hungry for stories of redemption, we see it over and over. You run a business that redeems old cars. So what you do, you can take something from a junkyard, pull it in, straighten it out, fix everything, get rid of the rust. And it might be a 2-year job, but you little by little, you can turn that thing back into it maybe even with motor upgrades and suspension upgrades, you can make it so much better than it was the day that it was new. Well, that is what Jesus does. And that's the story we're supposed to be telling. And it saddens me that not every Christian group does a good job of telling that story, because it's such a great story to tell. And honestly, I think it's an easy story to tell. You just have to understand the difference between, as I mentioned earlier, the biblical truths that will never change about Christianity and all of the other cultural norms within groups of Christianity that have become highly valued by people that sometimes get in the way of the real redemption story.
That's great. Not just because I own a restoration shop, but I think that's a great comparison. The car, because the car can't redeem itself on its own.
You're onto this, man.
Yeah,
That's good theology, Joe.
It can't redeem itself. So if I go to a car and I start yelling at the car, you need to be shinier. You need to run better. The car can't. It doesn't have the means to do so. And I think you nailed it there. the people that are trying to help you redeem need to be the ones to guide that. You have to be you have to shine it up a little bit. You have to block on it a little bit. You have to be that person to help them find that.
It gives me the picture of, let's say, a man raised in the 50s or 60s who remembers the beauty of the car. And he's got his grandson and they're walking by a junkyard and his grandson just says, "Papa, look at all that crap out there. Look at all that junk. I wish somebody would just get a bulldozer and shove it in a hole and cover it up. It's so ugly." But the grandfather doesn't see ugly.
All right. So we're back at it. So I forget where we stopped. We had a little.
So how do you want us to? You want me to go back to like the grandfather-grandson?
Yeah, let's
analogy?
Jump right back into the. So you were saying something about the analogy of the grandfather.
So yeah, it makes me picture this grandfather who was raised in maybe the 50s or the 60s, and he's got his grandson with him, and they're walking past a junkyard, and he looks out and he sees these old cars, Chevys and Fords and some Buicks, and just these cars that he remembers them the way they looked off the showroom floor. And he remembers, when nobody was watching, drag racing them with his buddies behind the local grocery store. He remembers taking his wife out on dates in the car and having the big bench seat where she could slide up against his, under his arm. And then his grandson, maybe, I don't know, 10, 12 years old, says, "Grandpa, man, look at all that junk. Look at all that crap. It's so ugly. I wish somebody would take a bulldozer and just push it in a hole and cover it up." And the granddad's like, "No, son, you don't understand the potential that exists in those broken, worn out, destroyed things. Let me show you what can happen." And then the grandson and the grandfather go down to the junkyard and they buy one of those car bodies and they take it home. And over the next 5 or 10 years, they work together tirelessly every waking minute they have. And little by little, you end up with this restored body that gets to be put on a frame and different things. So I don't mix metaphors here, but for me, the idea is that's what Christ does for us. As you were mentioning, you can't just yell at the car, "I wish you shined better. I wish the broken things in you worked." It doesn't work like that. The car is useless to repair itself. But when the master who knows how to bring about redemption does so, everything changes, for the car or the human being.
Well, let's continue down that path, because to me, what that actually kind of tells me is, as the grandfather's telling the grandson and they're making this journey together, there's someone who has seen what there is. He sees it still, even through that. And he can look as if a pastor, a minister, or someone trying to help from that position can look out and see what maybe the world doesn't. They see something that, the world sees something that's broken, that's wrong, that's unrepairable, but yet someone who's more can see that. And then possibly, instead of following the way of building that car, maybe it's a matter of that person then being able to tell that story to help, because what the grandfather had to do was show the grandson what he sees. And what a pastor or a minister, in my opinion, and this is I want to shift this to you, but in my opinion, they have to be able to tell someone who is broken and lost, "This is what I see." I want to say this really quickly, just because I want to get back to you. But there was a show. We talked earlier before the podcast about telling stories. So we kind of about what we're here, and it's a gift. And I remember a movie with Anthony Hopkins. So he's a master storyteller, and he was telling a boy, the boy's dad had been at a particular football game at the same time Anthony Hopkins was. They didn't know each other. This was, and his dad had passed away. So he starts telling the story of this football game, and he was telling the story as if what he saw, and then he would say, "And this is what your dad saw." And he drug you in. And I can remember that movie. I zoned into that story because of the way he told and the way he expressed. So I could see what he saw. And I think that's real important when you're in that position, because for me, if I had no experience at all and I walk in and you're just telling me stuff, I'm like, yeah, okay, it's just an old junk car. You got to show me. I got to see what you see before I can take that journey.
Yeah, that's really good, man. I think to take that to the spiritual side, and you talked about pastors being able to see that, it's not just what, say, I as a pastor can see in someone else, okay, but it's also what I remember in me, and that by that I mean, like I know me without Christ, and I can envision my life with me in charge of it, with me doing everything that my broken brain could come up with without guidance, direction, and grace from Christ. And so when the hope there is, when it's best communicated, when I would talk to somebody else who maybe is still living in that brokenness, hey, I want to show you what Christ sees in you or what I see in you. It's not just, hey, I'm living this perfect life and I want to help you live this perfect life. That doesn't translate very well at all. But when someone realizes that, you're just as helpless without God as they are, you're just as broken without God as they are, and somehow in the process of your life, God has effectively worked some things in you that he's not yet worked in them. And so that, that brings about the question, what do I do next? What is my response? How do I get on that pathway? And so over time, what ends up happening is through not just storytelling, but I would say relationship, friendship, and storytelling of helping people see this gospel. This is what it is that Christ is doing. And we've got loads of examples, of what he's done. That for me is so. To push back on our metaphor, last year you did some work on my car, my dad's car, really, and I had a mechanic before you, just a guy that I lived near, look at it, and he basically said, thing's not worth dealing with. You're never going to get it running. It's going to cost you way too much money. And I called you up, and you said, you better let me take a look at that before you take that advice. I don't know if you know this, but whereas the previous mechanic had said, you'll never get that motor running, it's never going to be useful, you called me after having the car for one day and said, well, we've already got it running, I'm like, oh my gosh, And so sometimes it's just having your life in the right hands, or in this case, your car in the right hands, so that the person who has it, you can trust them with it, and they're going to do something with it that's helpful. And that's what I believe the reality is with Christ, is that I would warn someone about putting your life in the hands of the wrong church. That's a problem. Putting your life in the hands of Christ, that's a great thing. And now I know you didn't bring me on here to just share that, but that's just my personal perspective and thought and idea, and what I would hope for anybody. Where that shapes me personally today at 51 is, if I want to, in a helpful, good, effective way, share that story with people, I can never forget that that's my story too. It's my story too. It's not just theirs. I have a story I tell a lot about being pretty infuriated with a Christian one time. There was this moment in a worship service where people are supposed to tell a little bit about your own story and how Jesus brought you from where you were. And I don't want to get into detail too much, but this particular person said, I was raised in a great home. My parents did a perfect job. I was a good kid. I got a great education. I met a great guy. I met a great girl. I got married. We got a great marriage. We raised great kids. I got a good job. And there's my testimony. And I wanted to go, bull. That's not true. That is not, that, a lot of the things in that story are true, but that's not all there is to that story, because no human being has that story. That is no human being story from the perspective of being a Christ follower. Everything begins with redemption, us needing it, him giving it. And so I hate it when Christians try to tell a whitewashed version of their story, because it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help them to tell the story that way. It doesn't bless God to tell the story that way. It definitely doesn't help anybody else who might be seeking something to tell the story that way. Let's tell the story honestly, and in doing so, I think you'd be pretty amazed how God uses your story in somebody else's life.
Well, that's, that story right there brought me back to a moment that I was in. So you're familiar, some of our listeners may not be familiar with the area we live in. It has some areas that are really prone to flooding. during the spring. And we're probably going to see that this year.
Maybe in the next 3 days.
Yeah. So I can remember being in a church service, and a fellow stood up to testify, and and he said, "Yes, the waters were at our door, and the Lord came down and blessed our home and blessed us and kept the waters away, and praised the Lord." And right behind him sat a family who lost everything in that flood, everything they had, everything they had worked for. And I can imagine how that might feel, even if you're like, God's good and he works in mysterious ways and all that. But at the same time, what did I do to God? Well, there's so not only, like you were saying, not helpful, can be hurtful.
Yeah, I would go there with you too. It's instead of viewing, again, it's that getting caught up in cultural morality where people see things that happen to them as either a reward or a punishment from God. I think that's the wrong way to view those things. If everything is God's love for us, helping us become the person he wants us to be. So in other words, using the metaphor we've used, sometimes when you restore a car, you got to cut it all to pieces. You have to do some serious damage to the car in order to bring it back where it needs to be. Whereas others might need different things in different ways. When we learn to see, hey, God did not spare my house because I did something right. And God did not take your house because you did something wrong. That's, for a Christ follower, that's not the story. That's not true. The story is, I'm thankful that my house was not taken. I care about you because your house was. We're going to walk through this together, and we're going to bear one another's burdens. We're going to help each other through it. And we're going to see what it is that God has for each of us in the way he's growing us as we walk through this. Because hypothetically, you could end up seeing the person whose house wasn't taken end up making an even bigger sacrifice by helping pay for the other person's house to be rebuilt. And in the long run, it may cost the person whose house was not taken more because of the way God brings back, resources and things for those who did lose. And again, it's not about who was being blessed and who was being cursed. It's not who's being punished and who's being rewarded. It's about how is God remaining faithful in each of their lives, and then how are they going to remain faithful to each other as they walk through that together. I don't know if that's helpful, but
very much so. Yeah, I could see that, and that's a great way to bring it back around. And it also is a way, maybe, to make that person who did lose their home. That's a way that actually could strengthen. He lost, and then he turned and helped me, and that is showing Christ through someone.
Amen. I do that. Absolutely.
So yeah, that's and also I can remember going through a lot of issues in my thoughts, and as far as like people of sin and how sin can destroy your lives, and I can see how, if I was I think there's poke berries. You remember poke? Poke.
Oh yeah,
it's kind of a big thing around here. They're very red.
There's no
they
classic
stain
rock song
bad.
called poke salad, I think.
Yeah,
isn't it?
my aunt still eats poke salad. So those berries are just, you touch them and it's like ink. It just goes everywhere. And for years and years, I was told, and everybody I know, was poke berries are poisonous, even though birds eat them like crazy. A friend of mine, he had some kind of remedy where he had arthritis, and he would freeze pokeberries and start with 1 a day for a week, and he got it up to 10 a day for a week. And whether it worked or it was placebo, it did. He couldn't get up on a frame machine before, and then after he could, but everyone was telling him, yeah, those are poisonous. And then he said, finally, he sent them with a nurse friend at church, and had her test them, and there was nothing at all poisonous about them at all. Not even like allergic. And that goes to kind of make me think, did, moms get tired of their kids playing with pokeberries, 50, 100 years ago, and say, leave those alone? And why? Well, they're poisonous, So, that kind of lends to that as well, that some of those things get started up, just as somebody trying to, we have to maintain a certain level of law and order. And so we had to give someone a law and order to follow, to keep them alive, maybe, or whatever. So some of that tends to So then I started looking at that. How serious are those things, those infractions? I got a little off turn there, but how serious are those things, and how could they send you to hell? When I look at eternity versus temporal, I look at temporal as if it was one grain of sand, 8 feet deep on a beach 10 miles wide. It is less than a flash of the eye. How could you possibly do something to condemn yourself to a place called hell for eternity with something that in its entirety of it is less than a blink of an eye? So that really made me start wondering, are we on the right track, spending 80% of our services condemning sin, or is there something we're maybe missing there? What are your thoughts on that? I mean,
yeah, it's a great question. And again, I think that, some Christian cultures spend a lot of time on condemning sin, especially if over time they've found that guilt is a good motivator. And again, I would say that the New Testament does not use guilt as a primary motivator at all. For those who do, I think it's a misuse of some things. Now, I'm not denying that sin is real and sin is problematic and sin, breaks, relationship with God. I'm not denying that, but that has to be kept in context of the big story. And so the big story is this: God creates humanity. Humanity, and we read this in the story of Adam and Eve, humanity as a whole turns their back on the one who created them. Like, nobody has a problem recognizing that in the story, the bad guy is the created who turns their back on the creator. Okay, now, whether or not people believe that literally and all that stuff, that's not even the point I'm trying to make right this minute. But although I do believe those are literal things that happen, but the reality from the story is that God made us and we turned our back on him. There's a famous YouTube clip from a guy named R.C. Sproul. In fact, I think I have this on a coffee mug. Somebody says something about referring to the punishment for Adam and Eve being so severe. And he says, he's an old man, and he goes, wait just 1 minute. He grabs the microphone, and he's a good guy, but he's like motivated at this time. He goes, the God of the universe reaches down into the dust and creates this creature and breathes into him life. And he then defies that God with the first thing he's been told not to do. And God's response to him is that he blesses him by covering his nakedness, by adding curses to his life that would motivate him forward. Curses as in things like toil and work, those kinds of things. His bride would deal with the issue of birth pains and that kind of stuff. But the greater punishment is on the one who tempted him to fail. The story tells us that the serpent's head will be crushed by the seed of the woman. And R.C. Sproul says, and the punishment was too severe. And he's like, from that moment, as we see, the good theologians would say far before that moment, God is planning out the development of their redemption story. And so, yes, sin breaks humanity away from God, but God uses that as a grand part of his story to bring about redemption in them. And so I'm going to throw something at you that I think is a helpful thought that a lot of people don't think. And I'm not saying every Christian would believe what I'm about to say. This is my personal opinion. And that is that to be redeemed is much better than to be innocent. To be redeemed is much better than to be innocent. To really push our metaphor, it's like a retro mod versus something being restored to its original. So the goal here is not that through Christ we become just like Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve had the potential for breaking it. Through Christ, because of what Jesus does on the cross, in the resurrection, in his life, and what the Holy Spirit does in us since then, we no longer have the chance of breaking it because he has bought it. He has provided it. He has gifted it. And so I then, as one of those he has gifted it to, get to live my life with the confidence and the peace of knowing that I can't even mess this up. Like this is him. He's done this. I'm not saying I can't mess up. I can mess up, and I do mess up regularly, but I can't mess this up in the sense that nothing I'm going to do is going to get in the way of what he's done. And so the sermon is not just, hey guys, you have sin in your life, you should change. But the sermon is beyond that. The sermon is, hey guys, hey gals, this is what Jesus did because you had sin in your life. And this is what Jesus does so that you no longer have to worry that you have to get it done. That's the real Christian perspective. Now, you don't always hear that. That's not always the way it's conveyed, but I don't understand why it's not, because it's very, very clear, both in Scripture and in Christian history for 2,000 years, that is the story that God is working through his Son to redeem his people that he created. They defied him, we defied him, but he is redeeming us. And therefore, the gospel is not an angry, frustrating, guilt-ridden story. The gospel involves conviction, like recognition of our own blame and our own flaws. Absolutely. But it very quickly steps into what Jesus has done to change us from that and to move us forward. And that really is the real story. And so for me, again, I think I said this, 20 minutes ago or whatever, the fact that the world's screwed up is not new information to any of us. I don't think I have to yell at somebody for them to realize that they're not the perfect this or the perfect that. It does help for people to think about that, like to get an honest assessment of our own character, an honest assessment of our own brokenness emotionally, philosophically, relationally, and really an honest assessment of the brokenness of humanity as a whole. But the story is about Jesus, and what he's done in us is constantly doing through us. It's never the primary point of the story is never, what am I going to do to make this right? How am I going to fix this? How am I going to impress him? That's never the story. And anybody who tells the story that way is just telling it wrong.
Wow. Well, okay. So I want to get into something, and you may want to go a different direction, because it's
I'm at your place, man. This is your table.
Well, and I'm not necessarily because this can come across pretty hard. And when I first came across it years and years ago, I kind of really questioned it myself. But when you went back to Genesis and the story of the serpent and Adam and Eve, it really brought back some memories of some things people had said. Now, what I'm about to talk about is something that would normally be considered heresy, but it's a question. It's a valid question, I think, that needs to be put out there, and there may not be necessarily an answer. And I'm not saying that I wouldn't necessarily follow what someone was saying, even if they didn't know the answer to this question. But there's been several different ways that story's been told, and we dabbled in that a little bit last time, but we never get into it because it is a really controversial way of thought. But it is a question that you're going to have. So if I'm trying to convince someone that this is the right way, or that this. I need to have some answers, or at least some understanding of what they're talking about. And for years, I want to say probably 15 or 20 years ago, I was dealing with some very hard things in my life. I mean, I struggled my whole life. Grew up very poor, and it's a broken home, and there's a lot of different things that happen, and drugs and alcohol, and had to deal with all those things growing up and figure it out on my own, because I was really different than my family. I didn't really fit in. I didn't have a lot of, and so I went on some searches, some deep dives, let's say, and I came across a fellow talking about Christian Gnostics. And he brought back that story because there's several books that may or may not have anything valid to them. Some of them one of those is called the Book of Truth. And it tells the story slightly different from what we know. And now, again, I'm going to put this as a disclaimer. I am not making any statements or anything that, I don't want nobody burning crosses or anything.
You're not going to hurt my feelings, man. We're having a conversation.
For everyone else out there, I'm just bringing up a valid thing that if you are going to be a person who's going to try to convince others, you need to have a little more understanding. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do, is find a more understanding. So the story that was told about Adam and Eve, that the serpent was actually the good guy in this story. And that the God that Adam had been talking to was not the true God. And that the true God, whom which did send Jesus to redeem, was trying to keep Adam and Eve in the dark, that they had, for one reason or another, they had been almost captured by accident. And the serpent came and told them that they do not want you to know the truth, because if you knew the truth, you know there's so much more to this story. And so then everything fell apart, and of course the story went on as it was in the Bible. And then you follow up when you're in Genesis, and there's an area, I don't know the exact spot, but all this Adam and Eve had both fallen, and God spoke and said it was speaking to someone. And for the best of me, I don't know who he was speaking to in the actual King James Version. And he says, now they are as we are. He said they are as we are, and that's when he kicked them out of the garden. And this particular religion believes that they were kicked out because they were trying to. So by having to work, by having to have children, and life is going to keep you so busy that you don't have the opportunity to question things, that you're just going to end up going with the flow and not knowing. It goes back to the whole matrix thing, the red pill, that we live in this matrix that is constructed for us to deceive us, not necessarily knowing why, but there is something beyond it. There's a truth, and that truth is why Christ came here, to try to redeem us and wake us up. So without getting crazy detailed, those are some of the things that I had run across, that those questions, and you have those questions, because if I'm not mistaken, the tree of life, or would also has been referred to the tree of knowledge, because that's when they woke up and they're like, holy crap, I'm naked. How do you go about that? How would you explain some of those things away?
All right.
Is there a way? And I know that's
a lot.
Really controversial, and I know it's a lot to do with.
Yeah. So right now, like my friends who know me well, they are all like pushing their hands together like this, going, how is Brad going to deal with that? I'm sure. So Christian leaders out there are like, I cannot wait to hear this. Or there might be some who are waiting to crucify me. Who knows?
Well, before you go on, I keep in mind, I'm not asking this question to give you an unanswerable question. And I'm not saying that makes a difference either way. It is just, I'm putting it out there because it is a question.
No, I'm happy. I'm happy to answer it. So I think there are a couple of different things we have to talk about that you said. So first of all, Gnosticism existed in the New Testament. You have multiple New Testament books, especially some of those written by the Apostle Paul, where when he talked about false teachers or specifically false teachings, it dealt with an early first century Gnosticism. Now, I don't know enough about current, what you would refer to as Christian Gnosticism. I don't know enough about that to make the exact connection between the two. Like it could be the same word used in different ways, but the first century Gnostics were people who wanted to be seen as or recognized as Christians, but they saw such a heavy separation between body and spirit that they saw all physical things as evil and wrong. And so, for instance, first century Gnostics believed that if Jesus really was God, then he could not have had a real human body. He must have been like a walking mist, or something like that. And so you have some of the New Testament teachings about like his body being physical that were intentionally included to try and disagree with that early Gnosticism. So that's one point. I don't know that has a whole lot to do with your question, but just because of the word Gnostic being used, I wanted to say that. So I have not heard before a perspective of the little g God to the way at the very beginning of Genesis that was giving them commands and demands and things in the garden, not being Yahweh, the God that we worship. I haven't heard that before. I have heard a lot of other kind of mystical, maybe mythical interpretations of the story of Genesis. I mean, of Genesis 1 and 2. It's such an amazing worldwide story that it makes sense to me that every creative writer for the first, hundreds of years after hearing it would have wanted to be able to find a way to add to it. Because it's even if you don't believe it as a literal story, it's a beautiful, cool, invigorating story. Okay. And so you have those things. My response would be that, as you mentioned, maybe current life, that we live in a bit of a matrix. It took me back to that blue pill, red pill story from the movies. I was a big fan of Neo and Trinity and all that in those movies. So I love that. I do absolutely think that we live in something like that. I just think that it's the enemy. Lucifer, Satan, term. He's the one that, the scripture refers to often, as kind of like Lord of the earth or this one who is lying to us in this world. And so there's no doubt in my mind that, yes, there are a lot of lies being told. There are a lot of things that are not true that seem to be true. It's very hard at times to know what is the real voice of God and what is an impersonator voice of God. I think all those are fair. And I think anybody who wants to ask that question, as you are, needs to ask it. I think it's just a fair and honest question to ask. Now, my personal opinion and my response to that question is, I, without a doubt, believe that the creator God of Genesis 1 and 2 is the God, the Father of Jesus, and that the intimate requirement between he and Adam and Eve was how they dealt with, and it's actually two trees. So the first tree is the tree of life. The second tree is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the idea was in the garden, as long as they didn't have a knowledge of good and evil, there would be no evil, and they would simply get to live provided for by this tree of life. So the imagery of the tree of life is a tree that produces everything you could possibly ever imagine to thrive in the world. Just imagine a tree that produces all the food, all the shade, all the nutrients that you're ever going to need, and it's right there for you, and you get to live in that. So that's, whether you take that literally or metaphorically, either way, the point being that this is life. That's a gift that's been given to you. When they sought after the knowledge of good and evil, which is the reason why they ate from that tree, and even the story told by the serpent was, if you eat this, you will be like God. The twisted part, from my perspective of the story, is that he says God doesn't want you to be like him because you will then be able to challenge him. But that's not the reality. The reality is not that we then get to challenge God. It's that we then now have to deal with the results of sin that was not a part of the Eden experience. And so, however, this is the beautiful thing about God. I just absolutely do not believe, and the Bible doesn't teach, that God put his hands on his head and went, oh no, oh my gosh, they ate the apple, like they ate the fruit. I can't imagine they did that. Because from the beginning, the goal was not having obedient people who never sinned. The goal was to have redeemed people who are, as the New Testament says, bought with a price and highly valued. And so their sin, which was their choice, which was motivated by the enemy's temptation, does result in some ramifications and some huge breaks in their relationship with God, but it opens the door for what Jesus would do in the future, and brings about their redemption, which is much better than anything that would have ever existed in Eden.
Well, so I guess I would actually want to we can go so much, and I don't think we need to do that. But I want to go ahead and hit on a couple things you said there, just because they're questions that not only I but other people may have. So I guess I need to have a better understanding of what you believe we are, or so you have this body, the vehicle to navigate this matrix. And you have a consciousness, which I would call which most of the people that I've talked to about this would be calling an ego, and that's developed. So your body is created during birth, and your ego is a development over time that the world around you, and then you got the spirit, which is a little harder to understand. So I guess my main question probably would be to get to the point. Do you believe that the human spirit, the spirit within us, is eternal? And if it is, eternity doesn't have a beginning or an end. So basically, Brad has always been and always will be. Help me with that. Help me understand that. Is your spirit created at the moment the body is created?
Okay, great question. Let me answer the first question first, and I'll answer the second. So, what are we? I think the biblical teaching is that God is Trinity. So God is 3 in 1, Father, Son, Spirit. So God has always been 3 in 1, Father, Son, Spirit. God will always be 3 in 1, Father, Son, Spirit. God is not created. God is deity. So in addition to being eternal, God is deity, which, he is the only deity, Father, Son, Spirit. We are created, but we are created to become eternal. And so the difference between us and God is that I would believe that we have a beginning. God does not have a beginning. We do not have an end in the sense that we are eternal, or intended to be eternal. That's kind of the goal. So God is Father, Son, and Spirit. We are body, mind, soul. You use the word ego for mind. I think that's a fine way. So physical, mental, spiritual. And so the punishment for sin is spiritual death. So every human being throughout history has a body and a mind that are active and working. But we have a dead soul, which creates for us something lacking, something problematic. Theologians talk about the imago Dei. It's Latin. It just means the image of God. So the idea that humanity is created, all humanity, believers, non-believers, everybody, all of us are created in the image of God. And part of that is we're created Trinitarian. We're created body, mind, soul. The brokenness that exists from sin is that Trinitarian reality is broken because we have spiritual death. And spiritual death brings about even physical death, which obviously would then be mental death. So, Adam and Eve could have lived millions of years, eternally, okay? But sin brings about death. And now we know that, the average age of an American man is, I don't even know anymore, 78, probably, something like that. They say guys die quicker, so I'm guessing that would be women maybe 81, something like that. I could be off by as much as 5 or 10 years with that, I'm not sure. But so we have that going on, but we still experience physical death. Long before we experience physical death, we experience spiritual death. So here's how God redeems that, is that in Christ, the work that he does on the cross, the work that he does through resurrection, and the work that he brings to us through the Holy Spirit is that we then are given spiritual life. And that spiritual life, which is bought and paid for on the cross, we refer to it as having our sins forgiven, but it's so much more than that. It's not just that there's an act of forgiveness, but it's more than that. It's an act of redemption, where that which was killed by our choices is now alive again. So it's not just, hey, I forgive you, but it's, I'm making this beyond what it was even before you messed up, even before you sinned. And so then, you have to ask the question, well, isn't there still physical death? There is, because the whole world is broken. And so the way that God remedies that is that there is spiritual death, but there is resurrection. And resurrection is where God raises us from the dead in new bodies, new mind, new soul. So resurrected body, mind, soul. And so in that instance, God brings about what is now truly an eternal being, but not just eternal in the amount of time it lasts. It's also eternal in the sense of the value of its life, and it's eternal in the sense of the quality of its life. And so the individual who's been changed by Jesus is one who has been given that which they never even lost fully. They've been given more than that. We don't just have body, mind, soul, but we have resurrected, redeemed body, mind, soul, which allows for all the beautiful discussion about eternity and heaven and all that stuff. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that would be my answer.
So I want to just kind of reiterate that I don't want to debate you. I wanted to have a conversation, and I'm just putting out those questions that people have, and people have these questions because they've been looking. And I think it goes again back to our idea of cars and business. For lack of a better term, you're trying to sell someone on this subject because you can't just throw a magic wand at them and then they believe. They have to be drawn in first. You have to give them this is what you're going to get if you come over here. Okay. Well, there's all kinds of other people out there on the street trying to sell. And in my business, someone goes to someone else. Maybe they don't do their brakes right and it's catastrophic. So in your business, the same thing. I hate to put that. I don't want that to come across as business, but I'm just kind of trying to make exactly people understand. So if somebody does it, if you don't get them to come and let you do the work on their vehicle, they could go over here and have a bad day with this other person that's where I'm at. And, there's a lot of these people out there trying to sell things. So I'm making a point.
Yeah, just as there are shade tree mechanics, there are shade tree preachers too.
Yes, and many different ways of thought. Ricky Gervais, one of the biggest atheists out there, he was speaking. He does this on all the talk shows. They ask him about, why he's atheist and blah, blah, blah. He says, well, I just believe in one less God than you. So I don't believe in any of the other gods that you don't believe in. However, I just don't believe in one. I don't believe in one less than you. So that's a pretty hard, comeback on that. So just bringing things in perspective with that. The next thing I would say is the Gnostics believe, Gnosticism, it gets confused with agnostic. Agnostic means you can't know. You can't know whether it's real or not. There's no way for a human to know. The Gnostics, however, believe that you can know, and there's an enlightenment, which would be similar to salvation. And then from that point, beyond that point, your body and your spirit has been moving away, or your body and your ego has been moving away from the spirit at birth. And at that point, it comes back together, and then you realize, oh, I'm a part of something much bigger than what this matrix is. Therefore, sin becomes somewhat irrelevant because it's not a draw. You're like, I realize that you and I are from the same thing, and me and Tupac and me and even the worst people in history all came from that same. So we have less of that draw for the sin, and it becomes much less important to talk about. And I've seen it referred to as like a magnet breaking on a table, and it shatters, and the smaller pieces, of course, go further away, and the larger pieces stay closer to the whole. And that's what Gnosticism is, saying that the whole of God is all of those pieces. And the pieces that are further away lose what they had and they in that transfer. Yet the closest ones would be like Jesus. He is and so he was, those people were then, or those spirits, I guess you could say, were sent to enlighten and awaken so they can be drawn back together. What do you think about that? It's a lot there. I know it's a big.
So I can't speak from a Christian Gnostic perspective, just because that's not where I'm at. Let me again. You ask some really great questions, and you set up through like paragraphs, lots of directions that could be gone. So I want to try to honor that. The first part we talked about, you talked about the salesman, like being I got to tell you, one of the biggest metamorphosis in my life was when I was younger. I felt the responsibility to convince people. Like I felt that if I did not do a good job with my sermon, or if I accidentally didn't talk to somebody in the lobby, or if I was in too big of a hurry at Walmart and got out the door before somebody got a chance to grab me, or if I didn't answer the phone when it rang, that first time, I thought that their salvation was in my hands and I just totally messed it up. And that's a huge weight to carry. And after a little maturity and some time, I'm convinced that it is not my weight to carry. So I don't have to view my job as having something for sale or selling something to people. And I think a lot of pastors do. And I think it motivates them to try to do their best. But I think it puts the motivation on the wrong outcome. So here's what I would say. Just as Jesus on the cross does the work to forgive sin and bring about redemption, and just as Jesus in the resurrection brings about new life for his body, for the body, and for just resurrection as a whole, it defeats sin and death and all that stuff. It's also Jesus through the Holy Spirit who is the one selling something. And by that, I mean, he is the one who's convincing. He is the one who's drawing. He is the one who is motivating. He is the one who is changing someone from the inside out. So let me put it this way. I 100% believe that that God changes someone on the inside before we see anything on the outside. So even like, I'll use an example. In the Baptist churches I grew up in, which were great experiences for the most part, the process that typically happened when someone responded to Christ is there would be an altar call at the end of the service. It's one of 10 songs that we sang, throughout the year. Very specific music usually. And it was music that was drawing, like encouraging people. And the idea was you walk out of your chair or your pew and you walk down the aisle down front, and then you talk to the pastor or a deacon or whatever, and you pray a prayer. And, that was kind of the method of how that happened. So what happened in me was, and this is not just in me, this is in the entire Christian Reformation and all that stuff, is the understanding and belief that person does not meet Jesus when they finally get to the front of the room and they finally talk to the pastor and they finally pray a prayer or whatever. That person met Jesus where they were standing in the moment that the internal motivation came over them to respond in faith. Now, they may not have known exactly what words, and there was some discipleship going on in the way that pastor, elder, whatever may have talked to them, but their life spiritually had already been changed internally by the Holy Spirit because he's the one doing that work. That prevents me as the preacher from getting any of the glory. That prevents him as the responder from being the one who did any of it. This is all about what Jesus is doing in people's lives. And so for that reason, this is a big deal to, I don't know if it'll sound like a big deal to you, but it's a huge deal to me. And I think it's a big deal to anybody who will let it really think about it. When I developed a more clear and mature understanding of theology, I recognized what was my responsibility and what was not my responsibility. And I had been guilty of crediting myself with doing a good job in areas that weren't even my responsibility for a long time, which meant that I was missing out on the blessing of knowing that I had been faithful in the areas that was my job. And so in the long run, here's the difference. At 25, I would want to craft this perfect sermon because if I didn't, people's lives would be screwed up. Like it's on me. Okay. Now I want to craft a wonderful sermon because I want to be faithful to the one who saved me, and I want to only speak truth. And how God uses that in someone's life, internally in them, how God uses that to speak to someone is out of my hands. It's in his hands and in some responsive way in their hands, but it's out of mine. And so I don't get the credit on the day that 10 people respond, and I don't get the blame on days that nobody responds. My goal is to do the best I can do to honor the one who changed my life.
That's so I'm going to say that you answered a question that I didn't ask, that I've asked many times. And maybe it comes across kind of crass, but you answered a question that I've asked a lot of people. And because I've said many times before, I know the Bible. I've read it through at least 4 times just to be out of orneriness, just I want to know.
The Bible, you mean to read the Bible?
And when I say that, I'm talking about the King James Version, and I had a Strong's Concordance to follow through with some things. Now, when I say I know the Bible, I don't know what it means necessarily, but I have read through it. I know a lot of things about it. And so I do know what they would talk about when they talk about hell and heaven. And I had a lot of questions about that too. But if hell truly is exactly as it's portrayed, as this darkness and burning, that's like, as you said something, that's extremely important, and if my mother was a drug addict and alcoholic, and as far as traditional thoughts beyond some kind of redemption at death, she's most definitely there according to the way I was taught as a kid. And that's devastating when you think about that. And then you think about people that you love, and the weight, as you said, does build up. So by what you were saying there, I'm like, if that's so important, then everything a Christian mind should be about, every waking thought would be, how am I going to save Joe? So to me, I would ask people that question, and maybe being a little bit of inside resentment, I'd be like, well, it's your job as a Christian. If you truly believe there's a hell, it's your job to convince me, to show me something that I haven't seen already, make me experience something that I haven't, to keep me away from there. But by what you're saying there is much more truth than what my question was. And that is, people they have to find that experience. I'm going to tell a quick story, and we can edit all this out, but this story is really pertinent to what we're talking about. I was in a young man in church, and they were having the church that I was in, they would have altar calls at the end, and it would be the Holy Ghost would be a thing that they would say would rush the crowd, and people would do crazy things. And I can remember this young girl who was visiting, and that particular church, the girls weren't allowed to wear makeup, had long hair, and she had earrings in. And I can remember standing there while everyone was praying, seeing something extremely powerful happen in people's lives. People sometimes tend to tell people that that's the emotion that a pastor will build and build and build until an explosion of emotion, and people are just captivated by that. But there's more to it than that. I truly believe this. I've seen it too many times, and I see earnestness there, and I see these people being overtaken by whatever you want to call the Spirit of God or whatever was in that room. And this young girl that was obviously searching for something. She was, just like you've said, people are looking. She was needing something in her life. And I can remember the pastor or one of the preachers walking up to her, and everybody's eyes are closed, and I'm standing there next to her, and he says, "Do you feel that, young lady?" And she's like, "Yeah." And just a very emotional person going on here. And he says, "Do you feel that? That's God. And God is telling you, you shouldn't be wearing those earrings." I felt physically nauseous as a young man, 20-year-old man who had no, when you're 20, you don't think about things like that. When he said that to her, because to me, I remember the story of when Jesus was walking through, and the person reached up and touched the hem of his garment, the old song, and he was healed. He touched something magical. And I believe that's what was happening that night. I believe people were touching Christ, God. And for someone, he doesn't need your help, or that doesn't need help from us. At that point, I think we should step away. And what happened then was he took all of that power that this young person was experiencing and defiled it with this idea that that's what was really going on. Whether earrings or not, or long hair, any of that, that's not what was happening at that moment. There was something very powerful happening, and he corrupted it, and then possibly corrupted it for the rest of that young person's life. Now, every time she touches something like that, that's where she's going to go, immediately to the sin. And yeah, so that's something that really irritated me.
Let me tell you, man, I don't know what I would have done at 20, but at 51, that dude and I would have had a conversation after that service. Just straight up. That's, I don't know the guy, I don't know when it happened, but that's just a complete manipulation. And he may not have done it intentionally. He's
Absolutely
probably doing
not
what somebody told him he's supposed to do. But you, man, I don't want to come across as angry, but I am kind of frustrated about, It's time that we pastors start actually reading the scriptures and paying close attention to what is there and what is not there. And yeah, there's discussion in the New Testament about adornment. Like it's there, okay? But the level of importance placed on it, and things like modesty and and treating your body like a temple. I don't mean to act like that's not in the scripture. It is in the scripture, but not to the point of demeaning a woman in a public setting in the midst of a beautiful moment with the Lord. One of the things it's funny, I've never said this before, but this morning I was thinking about maybe making a post on social media. And one of the things that I don't think I ever did it, but is this thought: something that can be handled in a private conversation should never make the pulpit. Never. If there's 100 people in the room and there's an issue with one person, no pastor should ever take that. They used to call this bully pulpit. The idea of, I'm going to use the pressure of the 99 other people looking at you to slam you and get what I want from you. It's just wrong. It's absolutely wrong. And if there was a young lady in my church, in the church I lead right now, if there was a young man or a young woman, and I personally thought that they were doing something that was heavy distraction, somewhat problematic in some way, okay? First of all, I would want to make sure that I know them well enough to get to have that opinion. You know what I mean? Like, I would want to care about them, know their name, know their story. I'd want them to know me. Secondly, I would want to sit down with them privately and just have a conversation about whatever the issue is. There is no way in the world I'm calling them out in front of everybody. There's an old story, and I don't know when or ever this actually originated, but I've heard it from like a bunch of different churches. But something goes like this. Okay, guitar player, drummer, whatever is out for the day, sick. Somebody remembers that Jimmy, what's his name, knows how to play, and he's 15. So they call up his mom, say, "Hey, can he come and sit in today?" And sure, no problem. I'll drive him, bring him down there. Well, 15-year-old Jimmy's, he loves guitar playing, and he's wearing a Led Zeppelin t-shirt or Nirvana or something like that. And he comes in and he assists the church and he plays guitar. And then before he gets out of the building, somebody's just on him about, don't you know how to dress or whatever. I'm thinking that is completely the wrong way to handle that. Now, is it possible somebody could wear a piece of clothing that's distracting in a public gathering that I might have an opinion about whether or not they should have worn that? Sure. Like, I'm not going to preach in a MAGA hat, regardless of my politics. I'm not going to preach in a Biden hat. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to divide people with my clothing. But if I did, I wouldn't expect people to call me out publicly and like just chew me out in front of everybody. I would expect people who love me to pull me out back and say, "Hey, let's talk about this. Was that a good choice? Do you think that helped?" And let me let me understand where you're coming from so I can make better choices in the future. And so, you got me kind of like,
poke the
bear, man.
I was 21, 22. So that has stuck with me. Not only that girl, I don't know, maybe she went on and changed her life to something different. But to me, I always thought that may have changed her whole idea of God.
Let me give a similar story with a different outcome. I and two other pastors were leading a youth event, bunch of teenagers, 150 teenagers, 10 years ago or so. Young lady from the crowd at the end, it's probably the most moving 2 hours I've ever experienced in my entire life. Lots of healing going on in people's lives. And I don't mean that in a weird way. I just mean teenagers who didn't have moms getting to interact with mother figures, teenagers who didn't have dads getting to interact with father figures. This one young lady comes up, and at the time I knew her pretty well, but I didn't know her well enough for the conversation that's about to happen. She hugged me and she whispered in my ear some details about the sexual abuse that she had been through. I had sons. I didn't have daughters. I got to tell you, like, my emotions went all over the place. Like, I wanted to find a guy and kill him. I just didn't know how to react. I was just I was not at my best. She asked me if she could turn around and tell the whole crowd what she had been through. I just didn't think that was healthy for her. So I grabbed the most reliable woman in the room. I said, "Hey, come here." And she and this woman went off and talked privately. I knew this woman had some experience with the topic, that kind of thing. I knew this woman would, go to hell and back for her, to help her through that. And I don't know, after 15 or so minutes, the woman actually came back and said, "I do think she can share some things." So we let her share some things. But the reason why we didn't just put a microphone in her hand when she was so vulnerable is I didn't want her to reveal painful things that she would later hope or wish she hadn't shared. I wanted her to have some guidance, some coaching, some help. And then I didn't want to rob her of the opportunity to share a positive testimony, but I wanted to give her the right to think through that with some coaching and some wisdom first. That kind of care, I happened to be the guy that was on the stage that night. That's not me. That was with a team of leaders who came up with that culture. That kind of care for a young person's soul is what we need to see from spiritual leaders, not a quick opportunity to make a big, bold something that would in some way maybe get a big reaction from the crowd, but harm someone unnecessarily, And so, I just think that you're talking about some areas where we as Christian leaders need to have some real wisdom in how we handle things.
I hate to keep using comparisons, but even Jesus did that. He spoke in parables so people would maybe understand a little better. But I see it a lot of times like a game, like a baseball game, and it would be like similar to a baseball coach going, "All right, we got to get these rules down and spend 80% of the training, even the games, talking about the rules and the rule." When the kids are like, "Let's go. Let's do this. Let's go. We figure this out as we go. And there's going to be some mistakes and we're going to fix those." Where you get in church, it's similar. A lot of churches, and now maybe I do have a little bitterness because of how I was raised, but a lot of churches just push on that so hard that they never go. They never become, actually start enjoying the fruit. All they want to talk about is the rot. They don't get to enjoy the fruit. And that's what, in my opinion, is missing in a lot of churches and would give people the opportunity to go to church long enough to experience something. Most of the time it's like you said, they get ran out before, even though you don't think you're trying to help and you're saying you shouldn't wear this shirt or you shouldn't do this. But that guy's like, okay. And in his mind, he's like, "Man, I can't wait to get out of here. I wish I'd have never came here." And then he's lost. We never even got to try to even taste the fruit at all. It was just, So that's my big pet peeve.
So here's a bit of an angle on that. Sometimes among Christian leaders, the idea of expending more, talking about spending more time with grace versus judgment. Some would see that as like some sort of move to watering down something, or like some sort of move toward liberalism or some sort of move. But the truth is that's not true at all. Highlighting the focus on the redemption brought about by Jesus is the most conservative, and I really don't use those words very often, the most reliably committed on the Bible as the Word of God way to teach the gospel is to spend the primary amount of time talking about what Jesus has done and is doing, and not putting people in a place of hopelessness, but bringing people into a place where hope is real and accessible because of Jesus. And so it's actually those who take the easier, more simple road of just griping about people's frailties all the time and constantly putting people down for their brokenness, and then wondering why they only have 13 people in their church, and blaming it on them. Well, if they just would repent of their sins and come here, we would have a stronger church. That's baloney. It's baloney. your church has got 13 people after 100 years because God doesn't want to send young new Christians to you because he doesn't trust you with them to faithfully care for them and help them grow. Become a leader who cares about the gospel and disciples people in the biblical way of life, and you will see God bringing people into your life that he wants to entrust to you to help them. And so, I don't mean to attack anybody, but just those are passionate realities for me, and it's important for us to get this. It's really important for us to get this, because here's what happens, I think, Joe, is that you would think, okay, Joe, raised in Livingston County, Kentucky, goes to a little country church, should have been hearing about redemption every week, should have been hearing about hope and promise and truth. And that doesn't mean anybody should have left out sin, but sin should never have been the primary focus. Redemption should have been. Christ should have been. So now you, as you've shared, spend a great deal of your young adult lives really struggling with what truth is. And you were in the place where truth should have been faithfully conveyed to you, often from people you trusted heavily. And it didn't, and it didn't. And so that's in many ways is heartbreaking. And I know that you are far from like a minority of people. There are a lot of people who've experienced that.
Yeah. And I want to say that you've definitely hit on some things that kind of, were hard for me. And I'd like to say that I'm grown now and that I've found some my way. And but there's still another one. There's another guy just like me, completely lost, looking for something. And there's no one in his family, no one in his, and then this guy is there. He's millions maybe, of people that need that. And I don't want anyone to struggle in the ways that I've had to struggle to get to where I'm at. And those struggles still to this day haunt me and curse me in ways of how I deal with, everyday life. And it all boils down to that idea. And maybe so my oldest son, he had a wreck about a year or so ago. First wreck. He pulls out and it was rainy and he didn't see, but he pulls right out in front of someone and they T-bow him. He calls me and he says, I could tell he's panicked, and I hate waiting for that phone call because there's some of them coming in your life. And I said, are you okay? Is anybody hurt? And he says, I think I'm okay. Nobody's hurt, but it was a pretty bad hit. I said, I'm on my way. And immediately, as fast as I could get there, I was there. And I got there so fast that I was pulling the vehicle out of the way for the police officers. And I went up and grabbed him, hugged him, said, it's all right. We're going to get through this. No, we're going to make this happen. I was looking at the situation going, yeah, this obviously was his fault. But instead of coming down on him and going, you should have known, what the hell were you thinking? We got through it. I got him home. So don't worry about it. We'll get getting food, got him settled in, let him chill out and calm. And then life went on. And about 3 months later, I was like, hey, you remember? Yeah, you need to be more careful there. You got to watch that. Use that as a lesson. And it would have done nothing for me to have done that right at the moment. He would have just, probably got defensive about it. But I see that as a thing that we're missing the opportunities to really touch someone, and that whatever that is that have seen is very important and very powerful. I do believe that without a doubt, and I just think it's too important to corrupt with this simpleness, that flash of an eye of something. Now, should I say that baseball should be played without rules? Absolutely not. But the game is why we're there. The game is why we're there. The rules help the game go, but we are there for the experience.
It's why Jesus said there are two great commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then he goes, these two things make up all the law. Like it, there's that reality. When I was younger, my kids were younger, I coached T-ball and I loved it. I was never a great baseball player, but I was good enough to coach T-ball. You know what I mean? And I remember a lot of parents were like, are we going to teach them how to handle stealing bases and do, and I'm like, actually, how about this? there's only 4 things you do in baseball. They're like, what do you mean only 4 things? Well, you have to know how to throw, you have to know how to catch, you have to know how to hit, and you have to know how to run. That's it.
Wrapped up.
That's the only 4 things you have to do. Like, so how about we're just going to teach these 5-year-olds how to throw, how to catch, how to hit, how to run. That's only 4 things they're going to need to learn. Now, of course, is there more to the game than that? Sure there is, but you're not going to get very far if you don't know how to throw, catch, hit, and run. And so we would have entire practices where one coach is working with these kids on hitting, another coach is hitting with these kids and throwing and catching, and another coach is working with this kid on running. And that's it. Throw, catch, hit, run. Throw, catch, hit, run. Well, the throw, catch, hit, run for being a Christ follower is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And does that literally mean that's all there is to it? No, there are more details that will come out. But does that mean that if you are great at those 2 things and faithful at those 2 things, that you will find everything else kind of fitting into your life? Absolutely. And that's where Jesus was. It's where we should be in the way that we help people. And not to get into too big of a theology here, but we're Christians. We don't live under the law anyway. We don't, the Old Testament law has its value and its purpose, but that's not who we are. Jewish people live under the law. Christians don't. And so we don't need to take all kinds of Old Testament law stuff and put it on people like a heavy backpack, because it's like the New Testament's extremely clear that that's not what we're to do. And so, and I'm afraid it just keeps happening in a lot of times in a lot of people's lives. So yeah, that's us, man. We are Christ followers, and this is all about the redemption Jesus brings.
Well, and I use that same all the time, and maybe my son could testify to that. I tell people, I said the main and only real law that Christ gave was love your neighbor as you love yourself. And everything else does fall into place. Then, if you loved your neighbor, you're not going to probably do 8 of the 10 commandments.
You're not going to mess around with his wife.
Yeah,
you're not going to steal his car. You're not going to.
Yeah. So all those things kind of fall in place. So, all right, we're getting into about an hour and a half. So I had other things I wanted to talk about, your family and your wife and your children. You talked about them last time. Maybe we'll catch that a little bit.
We'll do it again, man.
Yeah. There is a couple more real quick things. I do also want to next time maybe talk about the bourbon. I know you're a big bourbon fan, and
sure,
I dabble with it when I have a bottle in my office. I say it's for the good days, the really, really good days, and the really, really bad days. And then
I try to stay away from it on the bad days and then reserve it for some good days.
And then maybe we do it for an episode. We do the chess for an episode. That's one that I want to do as a complete standalone. I have a lot of questions there. Now I'm going to ask you something as we close up, and this is kind of. I have been watching this show on TV that captivated me. It's a comedy. You've had to have heard about it. It's called The Righteous Gemstones. Are you familiar with it at all?
I have heard of it, but I don't know anything about it.
It's pretty over the top. It's beyond. It's almost. But I will say this about the movie: it shows. It takes a very, very comical look at the mega church preachers and things like that, and pokes a little fun with them and goes way over the board with vulgarities and stuff like that. But I will say something that I caught right away was, even though this group of people in this mega church that they're portraying were caught up in that world, they still believed that they were trying, through even the misguided things they were doing, that they were trying to make people better and help them, and for people coming to worship with them, where it was getting that. And I wonder though, the final thing, and I know we've got into way too much I wanted to be a little more uplifting as far as, but what about the mega churches? Do you think there is a group? Is there, you almost, with the number of people we have in the world, you got to have something like that, to be able.
Yeah, I think it's the same question. What about the small churches? What about the mega churches? You're going to find great ones, and you're going to find some really diabolical ones. And so, I prefer not to use names, but I can think of a few mega church pastors right now that I just think are charlatans. I think they are totally selling themselves, and it's not about Jesus, and it's I mean, they use Christian terms and terminology stuff, but it's all about the millions and millions they can make, and at the same time, I personally know multiple megachurch pastors who are as faithful and devoted of men of God as I've ever known, and they are extremely careful not to let well, I'll give you an example. Probably the pastor of the largest church in America still lives like a middle-class guy. He pastors 100,000 people. And, I'm not saying he doesn't make a good salary. I'm sure he does, but he's not, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, And so as some mega church pastors become, and he's genuine, like super, super genuine, to the point that, lots of leaders could call him right now and schedule a luncheon and go up and hang out with him and, get some advice or direction. So I think here's what I'll say. This conversation pretty often. I think that anytime your influence is magnified, there is increase in potential for fall, brokenness. I believe that greed is very real. I believe that power is very real. And when a leader develops more power or more, maybe I should say influence, because that's not really a nuance of negative there. When a leader develops mega influence, okay, that leader needs mega accountability, and that leader needs to be surrounded by people who love them enough to tell them no.
Yes, very much so.
Not to be rebellious, not to stand in the way, but just to be able to say no, so that that person doesn't ever find themselves believing that they are the stuff, because that's when the shift happens. When a Christian leader begins to think it's about them and not about Christ, then you cease to become a Christian church anymore. Something happens. But here, the truth is, Joe, that can happen in a church of 50 people. Scope doesn't necessarily form that. I've met some leaders in some small churches who thought they were the stuff, and so we have a tendency to notice it in the mega churches, because I think that, they just get a lot more popularity and they get a lot more
publicity. They're out there.
Publicity.
Yeah, we see them.
Yeah, we know about them. And so there are some really faithful megachurch leaders. There are some really problematic ones as well. And I'm not in a position to be the judge of that. The Lord is, but sometimes things are pretty obvious.
Well, I think you hit it a little bit there. Power can be corrupted easily, and it does corrupt if it's allowed to. And I think Rick James said cocaine is a hell of a drug. And I think power is the same. It can be intoxicating. So let's leave it at that. And I don't think we talked about hardly anything we talked about last time. We talked about kind of the similar situation, but we got off on a lot of things. So definitely like to do it again. I enjoyed it. And I have to say, I've talked to hundreds of people, different people about religion, and you touch something different and you answer some questions that have plagued me for a long time. I mean, really, and I'm not saying that because you're my friend or anything. I wouldn't do that. But there's a few things there that really put it back into my court. So, and it needed to happen. So appreciate you. Yeah, it was great. Good to see you. And are you still dealing the King of David? You are doing something, a series on that. Is that right?
I wrote a teaching series that I'll be delivering in October, but it's actually going to become a book that'll come out probably next year. Just the life of David. We're looking at probably 12 different relationships that he had and how God used, and some of these relationships are strange.
I know.
Okay. So different relationships that he had with people and how those relationships either adjusted who he was or maybe unveiled a part of him that wasn't healthy or wasn't good. So some of them are happy stories. Some of them are skeletons and closet stories. I plan to come out with a book next year for that. But the teaching series at thechurchatwoodlawn.com or Woodlawn Church is going to be this fall.
Well, I'm going to check that out because David's
awesome,
always
man.
been my favorite. He's my favorite character. So
cool.
All right. Good to see you. Hope everything goes well. See you soon.
Thanks man.
Again. Yeah. Awesome.
See you.